To think, to reason, makes us human, sets us apart from the rest of nature. People communicate in intricate ways about complex subjects, and at the center of it all, a thinking machine, the computer. With it, our thoughts can be recorded. What once seemed impossible now seems commonplace. Today, computers are capable of amazing tasks that boggle the mind. But the evolution of a thinking machine, a computer, engaged some of the greatest minds of the last 2 centuries. The story of the computer contains squandered chances, fortunate accidents, frequent missteps, fantastic insights, and unprecedented genius. It is the story of a machine that helps us win a war, figures in the creation of weapons of inconceivable destruction, and sends us into space. The birth of the computer spawned the growth of whole industries, led to the world's greatest personal fortune, and will increasingly affect the lives of everyone on Earth. Thinking machines, the creation of the computer. Our world is increasingly filled with countless wonders that would not have been possible without one machine, the computer. Although computers are enormously intricate, their most basic components consist of simple devices that can be switched to either one of 2 states, on or off. The computer creates its magic by calculating with a speed and accuracy that far surpasses its human inventors. Computers stagger the mind with their complexity, but simply put, a computer takes information, processes it, and then outputs a result. It's all done with a unique partnership of hardware and software. Hardware comes in boxes. They're the physical components, such as the monitor and hard drive. Software comes on disks. Software consists of instructions that tell the computer what to do. One way to start this computational partnership is to type on the keyboard, providing input. The input is picked up by the central processing unit, or CPU, the computer's brain. Using instructions provided by software, the CPU processes the input. The magic behind the CPU is its blinding speed. Modern processors are measured in MIPS, millions of instructions per second. While processing, the CPU may retrieve data stored in random access memory, known as RAM, or data stored on a hard drive. Modern RAM is so quick that every second it can send the equivalent of 10,000 typewritten pages of information to the CPU. And modern hard drives can store the equivalent of 250,000 pages of typewritten material. After processing, the CPU outputs information, often on a monitor. The whole procedure is usually so quick that it appears instantaneous. Today, computers are so commonplace we take them for granted. But not long ago, computers only existed in the imagination of a few visionaries. The search for machines that could figure quickly and accurately has seized the human imagination for thousands of years. In fact, the computer's family tree has roots so deep in the past, it's impossible to know exactly where they begin. By the early 19th century, the European Industrial Revolution was well underway. And the development in production and commerce came from the maturing fields of engineering, navigation, surveying, finance, and science. The practical application of these fields relied on volume after volume of tables. Tables for trigonometry, tides, interest rates, multiplication, and gravity. Tables were critical. The actual figuring was done by people who specialized in mathematical computation. Surprisingly, these people had a familiar job title. They were called computers. These human computers toiled over their tables incessantly, monotonously, and made mistakes. Typically, tables were full of errors. The requirement for accurate tables introduced one of the most eccentric and brilliant figures into the story of computers, Charles Babbage.
Oh, Babbage was an extraordinary scientist. I mean, Babbage was a great scientist. Babbage was 100 years ahead of his time. You can't say that about many people, but you could say that about Babbage.
Charles Babbage represented that extraordinary element of British society, the scientist aristocrat. Many were known for their eccentricities, and Babbage was no exception. As a youth, Babbage devised footwear of hinged boards intended to allow him to walk on water. Never one to shirk adventure, he tried them out himself, but flipped over and nearly drowned. Babbage demonstrated his brilliance in mathematics while attending Trinity College in Cambridge. In 1820, Babbage was checking the accuracy of calculations made for the Royal Astronomical Society and kept finding errors. He reasoned that a machine could be constructed that would calculate the tables and directly print the results. He called the machine the difference engine. He drew up plans for a section of the device and had it built with his own funds in 1822. Babbage couldn't pay for the construction of the entire device, but since the greatest beneficiaries would be the British government and people, he made the extraordinary step of petitioning the government for a grant. In 1823, the Treasury provided the project with startup funds.
Government support for the computer industry is nothing new. It's very much a big topic in the news today, and it will continue to be. Computing is an expensive proposition, and it usually requires some government support if it's going to get anywhere.
Babbage hired a mechanical engineer, set to work on a complete design for the difference engine, and immediately ran into difficulties. The mechanical machine shops of the time were not advanced enough to produce parts in the precise measurements that Babbage's plans required. So Babbage designed better machine tools, which would eventually improve the entire state of British tool manufacturing. By 1829, Babbage had spent the £1,500 grant from the government and even more than that from his own funds. But only a few bits and pieces of machine had been completed. Babbage's project began to attract critics.
He was plagued by several problems. One of his problems being his perfectionism, another problem being that his work was not understood or appreciated by the people of his time.
Babbage had many enemies. Even London's organ grinders despised him because he had tried to have them banned as their music interfered with his thinking. But the inventor continued to toil, and finally, in 1832, there were enough parts to assemble a section of the engine. It functioned perfectly, solving equations and producing 6-digit results. But it was only a small part of the proposed machine. The skyrocketing costs and lack of results finally made the government pull its support from the project. Although disappointed by the cancellation, Babbage had contributed to the project's demise by suggesting that a new device he had conceived, the analytical engine, would be vastly superior to his old design.
Babbage, in hindsight, probably should have finished the difference engine and seen how far he could have gone with that before starting the analytical engine. There's no question that the analytical engine was more than he could handle.
Babbage was obsessed with his new idea. With the analytical engine, Babbage asked himself, why not build a machine that could solve any mathematical problem? At the age of 43, Babbage had the vision of a computer, a vision he pursued for the rest of his life. The extraordinary fact is that Babbage's overall design for the analytical engine had many components analogous to those in a modern computer. The heart of the machine, the mill, made the calculations, like the central processing unit of modern computers. An oblong structure, the store, held numbers to be used in the calculations, like modern computer memory. Instructions and numbers could be fed into the machine using punch cards. Much of what we know about the workings of the analytical engine came from the writings of Ada, Countess of Lovelace.
Among the people who understood what Babbage was doing was a woman named Ada Augusta, who was the daughter of one of the daughters of Lord Byron, the poet. She had studied mathematics as a child and had quite a bit of talent.
Ada met Babbage at one of his famous dinner parties that were often attended by the luminaries of British science and engineering. Babbage demonstrated the working section of the difference engine for her, and she was immediately captivated by it. She published a simple description of Babbage's vision for the analytical engine.
Ada wrote some descriptions of it, and she also appended to these descriptions a hypothetical way that this machine could solve an equation. And on the basis of those descriptions, people often call her the world's first programmer.
But she was never to program a real machine. As Babbage entered the last years of his life, his great work was unfinished. He had become cranky and suffered constant attack by his many enemies. In 1871, when London's organ grinders discovered that Babbage was ill, they surrounded his house and serenaded him, increasing his agony until he died. Only a small portion of the analytical engine was built in Babbage's lifetime. Babbage's vision of the computer fell into obscurity, and except for the detailed texts left by Ada, could well have been forgotten.
Babbage's machines, which were never finished, which existed for the most part only on paper, were proto-computers. They were mechanical, they used gears, they used metal shafts. They weren't computers in our sense of the term, that is, they weren't electronic digital computers, but they were abstractly and on paper mechanical computers.
It would be nearly 100 years before a programmable computation device would again be conceived.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Apollo 13, intended as the third lunar landing, had just lost 2 fuel cells and was venting oxygen into space, 200,000 miles from Earth. Soon, the second oxygen tank would begin losing pressure. The astronauts would die unless they could precisely align their spacecraft and fire their rocket to slingshot themselves around the moon and back to Earth. Critical to the alignment was Apollo's state-of-the-art guidance computer. A new trajectory was figured. The all-or-nothing rocket firing was made. The Apollo 13 crew miraculously returned to Earth with the help of their small and powerful computer. By the last Apollo mission 2.5 years later, computers as powerful as those on Apollo would be available to everyone. That was because soon before the Apollo 13 flight, an engineer at Intel, Ted Hoff, had come up with an ingenious idea. Hoff had been told to design 12 separate integrated circuits to make a Japanese pocket calculator. He suggested placing the entire processing unit on a chip and programming it just like a computer. Intel developed the idea, and by 1970 they had a working model of a microprocessor.
It was the invention not just of integrated circuits, but of a particular kind of integrated circuit, the microprocessor, that makes today's personal computers possible.
Smaller than a fingernail, a microprocessor contains many of the components of a computer, including a control unit, a clock, and areas where data can be stored and modified. Processing power was about to become very cheap and very compact. In the mid-1970s, 2 friends, Stephen Wozniak and Steve Jobs, were manufacturing a small computer in a Palo Alto garage.
Steve Jobs was a college dropout, but he was a college dropout with a difference. He was very intelligent, he had a lot of street smarts, he was also extremely ambitious. I think perhaps more important than that, he knew the other Steve Wozniak, had created something exceptional.
Steve Jobs sold his Volkswagen, and Stephen Wozniak sold his HP calculator to finance their company that would revolutionize the computer industry. Jobs trekked all over the San Francisco Bay Area to find buyers for the $500 machine, which they called the Apple I. The Apple I was large and unwieldy. Jobs realized they needed a new design for a computer that anyone could use. Wozniak began to build the Apple II. The fate of Apple changed dramatically when, in the fall of 1976, a visitor to Wozniak's garage saw the prototype of the Apple II. The visitor was Mike Markkula, who at 32 had retired from Intel as a millionaire. He was so impressed by the Apple II that he joined Apple and put it on a sound business footing. The Apple II was introduced to the public and sales skyrocketed. But in 1978, even with the success of the Apple II, using a computer wasn't easy.
The early Apple computers, as well as all early personal computers, did not have graphical interfaces. They didn't have mice. They had what's known as a command line interface. That is, you typed instructions into the computer and your instructions appeared as text on the screen.
A simple-to-use computer had been conceived by a computer scientist named Doug Engelbart. He demonstrated his vision in 1968 at the Fall Joint Computer Conference in San Francisco.
If I hit W, it'll say delete word. The arrow moves back and forth to give me feedback.
Wielding a keyboard and a pointing device he called a mouse, Engelbart worked with a computer 30 miles away, linked by microwaves, and demonstrated word processing and hypertext. Many in the audience went home inspired, but one group alone was to fulfill Engelbart's vision. That group was just down the road from San Francisco at Xerox PARC. In 1970, Xerox dominated the copier industry, but thought the future might be in computers. A young Xerox executive, Robert Taylor, worked with a team to transform the way the computer industry was perceived. As Robert Taylor himself remembers,
the chairman of Xerox at the time, Peter McCullough, made a speech where he said that Xerox was going to become the architecture of information. So I asked his speechwriter not too long after that, what did that mean? Because I had an idea about what it ought to mean, and so did some other people. And the speechwriter said, well, he didn't really know, but it's a ringing phrase. And so I said, well, we're going to make it happen.
Robert Taylor hired many of the country's top computer scientists and challenged them to create an easy-to-use personal computer. The result was the Alto, which incorporated many of the innovations in personal computers we take for granted today, all developed at Xerox PARC. The Alto used a mouse, a graphical interface, built-in networking, and printed on a laser printer. Xerox developed the Star, the commercial model of the Alto, but it never sold well.
Xerox was a large and very successful photocopier company. And it didn't really understand computers, didn't appreciate the brilliance, the originality, and the enormous commercial worth of the computer developments at Xerox PARC.
But Steve Jobs did. In 1979, Steve Jobs visited Xerox PARC and saw the Alto. He returned to Apple and immediately set to work on what would become the Macintosh computer, the first popular personal computer similar to those used today. What made the Macintosh easy to use was its operating system and applications, otherwise known as software. Increasingly, software was dominating the advances made in computers. Bill Gates, the young president of computing software company Microsoft, understood the importance of software to the future of computers and parlayed this vision into a vast software empire, making him the richest man in the world. The dream of a machine that could think had come from a mechanical device to an electronic one, where the bits of coded information that ran it were as important, perhaps more important, than the machine that they controlled. This may have been the best evidence that a thinking machine had arrived and could now be placed on your desk. Soon, nearly half the jobs in America would use the computer. Within the decade, microprocessors would be everywhere, incorporated into automobiles, appliances, and scientific instruments, significantly increasing their capability and reliability. Unprecedented fortunes would be made in businesses that hadn't existed a decade before. Education would be transformed forever, as the access to information would be transferred from libraries and universities to your desktop. The Earth would shrink with unprecedented speed as a worldwide communication grid became accessible to anyone with a computer and modem. And even now, the evolution of a thinking machine isn't finished. Computers have already changed the way we live, and they'll change the way we explore our world and other worlds in the 21st century. They will take us to distant galaxies, and they will connect us right here on Earth. Computers will continue to become more interconnected. They will continue to become smaller, faster, cheaper. And software will become more powerful. Minds that have yet to be formed will mold this power to create new marvels inconceivable to us today.